Welcome, 3D MJers. How are you doing? This is Eric Helms, and we are back with the second episode of Science and Application with Eric Helms, also known as Say What? And we're going to get into some science right now. All right, welcome back to episode 2 of Science and Application with Eric Helms. Say what? And in this episode, we'll be getting to the heart of what Science and Application with Eric Helms is about, as we will be actually evaluating the application of science. But not only science, we're also going to be looking at all forms of evidence, because as evidence-based practitioners, we shouldn't be limiting ourselves to just laboratory-based research. There's all types of evidence, and oftentimes there will not be studies on something, or something won't be able to be studied, and we have to know what to do in the absence of such evidence. All right, so let's talk about how we, as practitioners, look at the evidence that comes our way to help us make decisions. So first off, I want to give a big shout out to Alan Aragon. You can check him out at alanaragon.com. He has the Alan Aragon's Research Review, which is a great example of how to objectively analyze and put into perspective research. And I would advise everyone to check it out. It'll be the best $10 per month that you spent in your life. And it's got these reviews that are almost master's thesis length, running all the way back to 2008. You get access to them all. Great place for continuing education. So anyway, shout out to AA. And this is the hierarchy of evidence strength. Unlike my muscle and strength pyramids, this is not having the most important stuff built at the bottom, because we're not really building on top of the prior level here. We're talking about just higher quality as you get to the top. So at the bottom, we've got anecdote, tradition, and authority. Some people take the perspective this shouldn't even be on the pyramid. You know, if it's not research, I'm not looking at it. And I think that is definitely a mistake. Because research often mirrors what is happening in society. And we have to base our hypotheses on logic, experience, and our time in the trenches as practitioners. So, that doesn't mean that it's more important than the research done in a controlled environment. And not all anecdote is created equal, which we're going to talk about later. And often, tradition and authority are coming from a good position. You know, authority might be a scientific body. That might be your textbook, even though it may not have the references you wish it had. The tradition may be something that coaches have done for a long time in sports science, all based on their observations. Or it might be something very subjective, like the authority of someone who is just saying this is the way it is without any kind of rationale. Or the tradition is something that's just totally based in myth and lore. Or the anecdote of someone who is, well, not very smart and doesn't necessarily take a very systematic approach with their athletes. So not all tradition, authority, or anecdote is equal. So it can be very good or it can be very bad. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't be off the radar completely. You just need to be able to evaluate it each time it comes across. All right, next is observational research. This is basically research where you don't have a control group. Where you're not able to compare something to something else. Essentially, it's just very well-controlled anecdote. It's saying, this is what happened, and I know for sure this is what happened because I have the data run. You know, we had these athletes come into the lab and we tested their strength, their body composition, and we gave them a questionnaire on their psychological status, and then we also just watched what they did in the gym, and we watched what they did in the kitchen, and okay, so we know what they did and what happened. Great, good information. Very good to form hypotheses. It can say whether or not the approach being used was effective, but it can't tell you if it was better than another approach because they weren't directly compared. It also, you can't necessarily know which of the variables that they were doing caused which of the things, so nothing is drilled down. You don't have a second group that's doing everything else the same except for one thing, and you can say, oh, that's the effect of that one thing. So that's the drawback of observational research. Is it's essentially a good way to think of it is it's highly controlled anecdote. It's anecdote you can trust that was done in a laboratory, but you can't really make statements about comparing it to anything else or knowing among the many variables that were affecting the outcomes which caused what. Next, we have a randomized controlled trial, and this is basically that next step where you have two groups and only one thing is different between the two of them, or you have multiple groups and a few things are different in each group, so that you can drill down the specific differences in the groups to what was changed. And these normally have a lot of other things in place that can affect their quality. Not all RCTs are created equal. You can have some that are low powered, meaning they don't have enough of a sample size to give you a lot of confidence in the statistical findings. Or you can have ones that The sampling wasn't very good. Uh, maybe you don't always want to be randomized. Maybe you want to actually counterbalance the groups so they have matched levels of strength or training experience or what have you. So how you actually select your participants, how many participants there are, um, whether it was double blind or single blind, which isn't always possible. You can double blind means that the researchers and the participants don't know what the difference they have to the other groups are. Sometimes that's simply not possible. Like if there are differences in training, the athletes are going to know what the training they're doing is. Maybe the researchers are blind to it; they only see them when they come in to do the testing. But anyway, you can think of many examples where single, double blind is not an option. Maybe you can't do any blinding. Maybe you can do one or the other. These can eliminate bias, but not always. You can do a placebo-controlled trial if it's like you're testing a supplement. If it's just a pill being taken, it could be something that doesn't cause anything, and that way you can eliminate the effect of belief and kind of really drill down to whether the intervention has an effect. And RCTs are very, very powerful tools. They're right up at the top. The reason that they are not at the tip top is because of many of those potential faults they can have, specifically related to sample size. And in sports science and exercise science and nutrition research, we're often dealing with very low sample sizes, and we're much more prone to seeing errors. Either errors that come from we didn't have enough power to say conclusively that there was an effect, or there was an effect that was due to random chance, and it was just more likely to happen because we're dealing with such a small sample size. And one or two people who have an abnormal response can really throw off the findings when that's 20% of your participants. So a great way to get a big picture view of what's going on in the grand context of everything is a meta-analysis or a systematic review. I think a meta-analysis would probably be one step above systematic review, but a systematic review is still pretty good. So basically, a meta-analysis is essentially making all of the RCTs that are on the same topic into one big study. So instead of having a sample size of 10, you might have 10 studies with 10 people in each one. And now you've got a sample size of 100. So you can combine all the findings of these meta-analyses and say, okay, if we'd had a 100-person study, this is what we would have found. And now we have a much more confident view of what the effect was. There are some downsides to meta-analyses because not every study is done the same way on the same topic. But if you have a rigorous inclusion criteria and a way to control and weight the effect of the data, you can statistically be pretty damn confident that it was done in an effective way. And there's actual stats that are done in a meta-analysis of RCTs. So it basically is making all the RCTs into one big RCT. A systematic review is done when, for whatever reason, often it's just there's not enough or the studies are too different from one another, that you are doing a comparison of RCTs without actually running stats, right? And this is basically saying, hey, there are 7 studies on this topic. 5 of them found this, 2 of them found this. That means we probably think this is going on, and this is the reason there might have been differences. And you evaluate subjectively the differences between the studies. And a well-done systematic review should be right up there with, almost reaching the quality of meta-analysis. So that's basically a way to look at it all, but there is a little more detail to the way the research works that I want to talk about. So first off, let's talk about mechanistic versus applied research. In observational research and even in RCTs, sometimes the wrong conclusion, or rather, I should probably say, a too aggressive of a conclusion or a early conclusion, someone is jumping the gun, is made off of what is called mechanistic research. So a mechanistic research is essentially examining the mechanism by how something works, or is specifically examining a mechanism. Applied research is looking at things in a way of going, hey, this is similar to what is done in practice, but we want to compare the two to see which practice is better. And there should be a flow. Mechanistic research helps us form hypotheses. It helps us understand the way things work, and that can help us design better approaches to applied practice. Then we test that in an applied research setting, and if it works well and consistently, then it actually goes into practice, and then the practitioners can evaluate, does this consistently work as effectively as I hoped or not? Okay. Often what happens is that people will jump all the way from mechanistic to practice. And sometimes this is done out of bias, just you know, you already think something should be done a certain way, so you see research to support it, so it takes a higher value in your mind, often subconsciously. Sometimes it's done because there is no applied research on a topic, so it's kind of the best evidence you have, which we're going to talk about later. Um, and sometimes it's just done because people don't understand this relationship of how it should work. So I'll give you an example. Um, we grow muscle, right? And that's something that we all care about as bodybuilders and powerlifters. Um, However, the actual measurement of, say, muscle thickness or cross-sectional area change or lean body mass in a research setting is not the same as measuring the mechanism by which we grow muscle. So, for example, the mechanism of adding protein, muscle protein synthesis, is not the same as actual measurement of muscle thickness by, say, ultrasound. And oftentimes we will see researchers and practitioners and just, scientific authors who write about studies who will go, oh, look at this approach increased muscle protein synthesis the most, therefore this is what we should do in practice. And that's essentially jumping from mechanism to practice. And that has some significant issues because often in the body, the final outcome of what we see is due to many, many, many mechanisms. Even though there might be a dominant mechanism, it can be affected by so many other things. And we're only aware of the mechanisms that we're aware of. And physiology in the body is extremely complex. So when you make the jump from mechanism to practice, it's a very arrogant thing to do. And more often than not, you'll end up being wrong or at least partially misinformed. So that's something that can be problematic. And a good example of this was there's a study by Mitchell et al. That found there was not a correlation between muscle protein synthesis and actual muscle gain over the course of a training study. Now, this doesn't mean that we totally dismiss muscle protein synthesis. We just have to be aware of the limitations. So if you understand the way the mechanism is studied, then you can start to understand why you shouldn't, bet the whole farm on it. So for example, muscle protein synthesis typically is a study that lasts hours rather than days, weeks, or months, which would really be necessary to measure change in muscle growth. And it's a snapshot, often done in a fasted setting after not normal training in a laboratory, and it's really just measuring what the movement and kinetics or how amino acids in the blood are taken to and from the muscle. And that's not the same as actually building muscle over time. Really, you're just kind of getting a one-off snapshot over a few hours, and we don't know necessarily what muscle protein breakdown looks like or how that plays out over the long term or what compensatory things are going on in the body. So it's just basically a big leap of faith to go directly from mechanism to practice. All right, so that's an important understanding to have, is mechanistic versus applied. And we're going to talk more about some of the nuances of that on the next slide. So what I was getting at here was basically you need to determine whether you're looking at a surrogate or an actual measure of something. So when I say surrogate, I mean something that functions in place of something else. So for example, if there's an EMG study and it says, hey, when you do the incline dumbbell press, and this is not a real study, I'm totally making this up, it has greater activation in the clavicular head of the pectoralis major. Therefore, if I want to actually grow my pec major, the upper portion and the clavicle, I've got to do dumbbell press. It's better than flat dumbbell press. Well, that's nice, but this is an EMG study. It lasted maybe 45 minutes at most, right? To do the few sets on bench and then to do the few sets on incline. That's not a 3-month study of people doing the 2 exercises and seeing which one produced more growth in the upper pec. And there are many things that have to do with EMG that can limit the applicability of findings, and it's simply not the same. It doesn't mean that you can't make the inference in saying, oh, that might be more likely. But again, if we go back to our previous slide, you do the mechanistic research first, and then you do the applied. So rather than saying, oh, we got that good EMG measurement in the upper chest, I'm going to go run with that, the next step is to go, right, so let's do a study where the chest exercise being used in the group is incline in one group and then flat in the other, and then we'll actually measure muscle thickness in the clavicular head of the pec, right? So that would be the appropriate take, and then you would see if the mechanism held up in practice or if it made a difference or not. Or perhaps because you can use a heavier load on flat, it compensates for the fact that that you don't get as much EMG in the upper pec. And again, that's not a real finding. In fact, I don't think that's ever been found. It's just an example. So that's one example of a surrogate measure versus the actual measure. Another would be what I already talked about, muscle protein synthesis versus an actual measure of hypertrophy. Another one would be fat oxidation versus a measure of fat loss. And a great example of this recently happened out of Kevin Hall's lab. He did a very, very short study that had a ultra low fat group versus a high fat, low carb, borderline ketogenic group. And it was a study that lasted, I want to say, a day or two at most. And I could be wrong there, so feel free to correct me. And they looked at, because they didn't think they'd see measurable fat loss in this period, they were basically testing the insulin hypothesis and seeing that on a high carb diet with a calorie deficit and low fat, if there would be usage of fat, or if it would be blunted by the high insulin. And they found, oh, there's a high insulin in this low calorie, high carb, low fat diet, but they were burning a whole lot more fat than not a whole lot more, but they're burning significantly more fat than the group that was on a high fat, low carb diet, which is a huge finding. But we can't jump the gun, because when it's only a day or two, we're not actually sure, what's going to happen. So Kevin Hall, like the good researcher he is, he then just recently, and it's going to come out soon, did a 4-week study comparing a ketogenic diet to a non-ketogenic diet, looking at fat loss changes over time. So that's an example of the way research should go, is you look at the mechanism, and then you look at the application of that in an applied setting before then you make recommendations about what should happen in practice. Okay. Another example would be a highly specific laboratory strength measure versus a true 1RM test. I recently wrote an article about citrulline malate, how I was starting to be convinced by the evidence, once there was a lot of it out, which we're going to talk about, that maybe this is a supplement that strength and physique athletes should think about. And primarily I was recommending it for high volume blocks of training that were fatiguing. And I said, there might be something to the potential for it to increase strength. The reason why I didn't really say, yeah, and it's good for strength too, in a very clear way, was because the only study I saw was one on hand grip strength. So they grabbed a dynamometer with their hand and squeezed it as hard as they could, and they found the group that supplemented with citrulline malate had better grip strength in that measure, and it was, I think, Masters female tennis players. This is not the same as doing, say, a 1RM back squat or a 1RM bench press. And again, this is a highly specific laboratory-based measure, and it's not the actual thing we care about. The actual measure we care about as, say, a powerlifter would be the 1RM on a squat, bench, or deadlift. An isokinetic dynamometer or a hand grip measure or some other mid-thigh pull are interesting, and they would indicate that perhaps this would have an effect on 1RM, but we don't know for sure. And often those relationships don't pan out. So again, you really want to make sure that when you have confidence in a study, it's because they're using the actual measure, not a surrogate. And then this one is not actually a measure, but rather a surrogate population. And so animal research and versus human research. We have, we're quite different to animals, sometimes in very important ways, which limits the application of research. And really, in the same way that a surrogate measure is evaluating a mechanism, I think animal research should be looked at the same way. If something pans out in an animal, then we can move it to the next stage. This is a bigger deal in like drug trials, where they actually have a systematic process of testing something in vitro, and then in an animal, and then in a pilot study before they go on to the full RCT with humans, just for safety. And that same relationship should be seen in our field of nutrition or exercise. Animal research is useful at times, especially when you want to measure something that you simply can't study in humans. It's not ethical to do certain things to people, and certain laws and groups think it is more ethical to do it with animals. So arguably, you could make a case for a time and a place for animal research when it is a study you simply could not do with humans. And again, anytime there is not the actual measure, there's nothing wrong with making the best conclusion you can make off the surrogate. But in all cases when both are available, you should be going to the actual measure. It always trumps the surrogate. All right, so the take home here, what should the practitioner's perspective be? What are you going to do with all this information I've given you? First, I want you to take this message to heart, and this is a little cliched, but it's very true. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning that if you don't have evidence to support something, it doesn't mean that that thing is false or doesn't exist, right? What I'm saying here is that oftentimes in the field, we'll be doing things where we don't have a study to support it. In fact, the vast majority of the in-game calls that you're going to have to make if you're a personal trainer or a coach are things that are going to be based on an understanding of concepts and the situation. You're not going to be able to always support what you do with a PubMed reference, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I far too often see people critique the methods that a coach will use because there's not evidence to back it up. Now, until there's a study showing that what someone does is detrimental or not the best approach, you can't really say, oh, they're doing something wrong. All you can say is, oh, we haven't studied that. That doesn't mean anything except for the fact that it hasn't been done. We didn't have research on anything until we had the research. So again, an absence of evidence doesn't mean that you should be paralyzed, not do anything, or criticize people who are doing something in the face of the absence. That's why it's important to have a good theoretical understanding of the way things probably work, and that's why that expert opinion, tradition, and authority is actually on the hierarchy of evidence. Because when there's not good research to show you how to do something, taking a look at some of the best coaches in the industry who are intelligent and take an evidence-based perspective in general and figuring out what they do, that's probably the best evidence available. All right, also, here's a really good one to take home, is that one study never answers the question. There are no studies that put the nail in the coffin. That's why the RCTs aren't quite at the tip top of that evidence-based hierarchy. Really, we need the RCTs to answer questions. Sorry, the meta-analyses to give us that broad perspective, or at least a systematic review. I'm not saying that you can't use a study to guide your practice when there is not a good systematic review or meta-analysis available. In fact, you can. But remember that because of the small sample sizes and the many ways that studies can be set up in a way that doesn't quite represent real life, often one study will get something wrong or have some caveat in there that's very important. I recently saw an article where someone was saying that every time you diet, you should be gaining muscle and losing fat simultaneously. And then they used a specific study where this occurred as evidence to do so. However, this was a study on recreationally trained people who only exercise, not even necessarily lifted weights, once or twice per week. So if the wrong person reads this article and they're thinking, oh man, the last time I cut, I lost a bit of muscle, and this person has been lifting for 4 years very effectively and very hard and is close to their genetic ceiling, they can't really expect to get the same results that some newbie does. So perspective's everything, and every study has so many limitations, so you can't quite ever answer a broad question with a single study. So one thing that you can do is do what I'm just calling an ad hoc meta-analysis. A good example of this, for those of you who are aware, Alan Aragon, who I'm just pimping the hell out in this presentation, wrote a really good article called Nutrient Timing Revisited, Is There an Anabolic Post-Workout Window? I think this was in 2013, and this was a precursor review to the meta-analysis that came out on protein timing that he did with Krieger and Schoenfeld. And even before this, what I would label a systematic review that he wrote, he was talking about the research on nutrient timing around training in the Alan Aragon Research Review back in 2012. So as he accumulated evidence and decided to do more and more with it and finally got himself in the PubMeds, he increased the quality of evidence. He went from writing about it and doing what I'm going to describe as an ad hoc meta-analysis to a systematic review, then eventually to that meta-analysis. So what he did back in the AARR days, and back when we were, he was really making everyone aware that, hey, all these studies on protein timing and carbohydrate timing around training are not consistent. And a lot of the times we're not only changing timing, we're changing the total intake over the course of the day. And he basically pointed out, hey, there are X number of studies, but only Y number of them are showing the outcome that people are talking about. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like maybe out of the 7 studies where people are actually manipulating not only the total amount, but the timing of nutrients, 5 don't show a difference. So that was something that was basically an ad hoc meta-analysis. He didn't do a true statistical analysis, but he said, hey, there's 7 studies, 5 don't show a difference. Maybe we need to take this off the pedestal and put it in perspective a bit more. And then he did the systematic review, and then he did the meta-analysis. So anytime you're wondering about a specific topic, if you can gather all of the studies you're aware of on it, and do a pretty rigorous job of that, spending maybe an afternoon really trying to check out and trying to figure out where the studies on a topic are, and I've done this before when I write about things or talk about them. If you've got a good chunk of studies from a broad range of researchers over the course of multiple years, um, and the majority of them point in a certain direction, that is basically your quote unquote ad hoc meta analysis, where you go, all right, the majority says this, so I think that's the best decision we can make in the face of not having the highest quality of evidence. Um, yeah, and this is going back to that comment I made earlier about not all anecdotes are equal. I will sometimes, and actually some evidence hierarchies have shown this, that I think a very high quality expert opinion is better than some of the more mechanistic or observational research. Research that's done in vitro or basically in a petri dish or in a rat that is highly sanitized. That's nice, that's good. They can form a hypothesis there. But if I've got to either use that or, for example, the experience of someone I highly respect who has a very systematic approach to what they do and keeps careful records, I would probably use the latter. There's some good examples that have happened recently. Mike Tuchscherer from Reactive Training Systems, he collated a whole bunch of data from a lot of his lifters and looked at different outcomes in terms of frequency, volume, intensity, and success rates and how much muscle they gained following a program. And this is not, peer-reviewed research, but this is equivalent of the highest quality of anecdote you can get, highly controlled observational in the trenches anecdote, which I think is a pretty damn good thing. And Bryce Lewis with the strength athlete recently did a similar thing on a study where, I call it a study loosely, where he examined whether or not the people following a program he gave them thought they were getting week-to-week coaching, whether they thought it was a pre-prescribed plan. And so these are the type of people who I will definitely put up on a pedestal and go, they are really controlling the evidence. They're trying to do this as rigorously as they can without actually being a university researcher. And I think that's fantastic. That's something that is way different than a random insta-famous person saying, "Hey, the broccoli got me shredded." So not all anecdotes are equal, and being able to differentiate between them is going to greatly help you when there aren't RCTs or there aren't meta-analysis or there aren't even observational studies to follow. And that leads right into the point of that you want to use the scientific method in your practice. You should be getting better as you work with more and more people because you've accumulated more data. You can make your experience as a coach more valuable if you are taking an approach where you can clearly see what is causing what. You change one variable at a time, you emphasize how much of importance it is to the person you're working with, that they keep everything else the same, and you work on having a relationship that has a high quality of adherence. That way you can consistently see trends. When you modify X variable, Y happens. And this is an approach I've always tried to take, but I've gotten better and better at over time. And this is why some people don't seem to get better with experience, is because they take the shotgun approach every time, or they have a very haphazard reporting system, or they don't have very good communication with their clients, or they have so many clients they can't keep track of what's happening and who is who, and they're just barely flying by the seat of their pants. All of these things can prevent someone from getting better over time and having a better idea of what works and what doesn't. So make sure that you have a good feel for who you're working with, what your changes are and what they're doing. You keep good records. At 3DMJ, we have Excel sheets that go back all the way to the start when we work with someone, and we can see trends in macronutrient intake, training, body weight, and then we can even see the pictures that came with it at those times. So there are a lot of ways to do this, but no matter how you do it, I think you definitely want to take a systematic, scientific approach in the way that you collect data, as it'll make you a better practitioner.
All right, and that's all we've got for this episode of Science and Application with Eric Helms. Say what? We'll see you next time.